Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sanjeev Verma. I'm a co-founder of Prevail, an end-to-end encrypted email and file sharing platform for information security and compliance. We are honored to partner with the NIST MEPs from Texas, Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont to host today's important webinar on the countdown to CMMC. A warm welcome to the over 2,300 participants registered for today's webinar, who represent small to medium defense contractors, primes, higher education institutions, CMMC AB registered practitioners, C3PAOs, as well as some international defense contractors as well. There are several reasons for the strong interest in today's webinar. The first is that adoption of CMMC, which is now less than a year away and will have wide-ranging impact on the entire defense industrial base, is becoming a reality. But even more important is the chance to get a program update directly from our distinguished speakers, perhaps the most senior DoD officials responsible for implementing the CMMC program and executing its rollout. Ms. Stacy Bostjanick is the director of the CMMC program in the US Department of Defense. She's a member of the Senior Executive Service and serves as the Chief of Implementation and Policy and Deputy CIO for Cybersecurity in the Office of the CIO. Ms. Bostjanick is responsible for shepherding this critical CMMC program through the federal rulemaking process and ultimately implementing the program across more than 220,000 organizations that make up our DIB. This includes collaborating across the federal government with partners such as the Department of Homeland Security to standardize the CMMC process and truly federalize it. Additionally, Ms. Bostjanick is responsible for ensuring that the defense acquisition community is trained and capable of incorporating CMMC requirements in their programs. In short, she serves as the focal point to implement the CMMC program across the defense industrial base. Our second speaker, Mr. David McKeown, serves as the Deputy DoD Chief Information Officer for Cybersecurity, and he is the Department of Defense's Senior Information Security Officer, CISO, SISO. In this role, he provides expert policy, technical, program, and defense-wide oversight and support to the DoD CIO on all cybersecurity matters. He's responsible for leading DoD-wide cybersecurity programs. He partners with industry to improve cybersecurity and information sharing through the defense industrial base. David represents the Secretary of Defense and the DoD CIO in international discussions and negotiates cybersecurity topics in both bilateral and multilateral channels. Mr. McKeown has over 35 years of experience in the DoD, which includes 27 years of distinguished service in the United States Air Force. As an Air Force cyberspace operations officer, he skillfully led numerous organizations and high visibility initiatives. Well, Stacy, David, thank you for shouldering the enormous responsibility for national security. It is my distinct privilege to welcome you both to today's webinar. Our format today will be as follows. Ms. Bostjanick and Mr. McKeown will provide individual updates on the program, following which we will have a question and answer session where they will answer some of the most frequently asked questions and provide additional color on their presentation. I want to repeat that the webinar will focus more on topics pertaining to organizations that handle controlled unclassified information, or CUI, and require level 2 advanced certification, though Ms. Bostjanick and Mr. McKeown will certainly refer to level 1 as well. So without much ado, over to Ms. Bostjanick to kick off today's webinar.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us today. It's always a fun time to be able to get in front of you guys and give you an update on where we are. So just as a little bit of a backtrack, last spring, we when the administration came in, we decided to do a pause and review the CMMC program, and we had a Tiger team that got together and put together about 8 recommendations on how to improve the program, which went into an executive steering committee that Mr. McKeown was on with us to help us make these important changes to the program to ensure that we were meeting the goals that the department had for CMMC, as well as ensuring that we were not being overly onerous to the small and medium companies to be able to become cyber secure and handle our controlled unclassified information. So to that end, we made some big changes to CMMC. If you go to the next slide, one of the main things that we did, if you remember, go to the next slide too. If you go to, if you remember CMMC 1.0, we had 5 levels of certification there. We've streamlined that down to 3 to make it easier. And what we did with level 2, and we stripped out the extra 20 requirements and the 3 maturity practices and brought it back in line with the NIST 800-171 to ensure that we were in lockstep with the rest of the federal government as we move forward. Then we have level 3, which is a subset of the requirements out of the NIST 800-172. We're going to require a baseline amount out of 172 for the level 3 of about 24 of the 35. So CMMC has been streamlined. A couple other changes that we made was we recognized the need for plans of actions and milestones, that it may not be necessarily effective for all companies to be able to meet all 110 requirements at the get-go. And so to that end, we've come up with a POAM plan, which would, companies will be allowed to POAM those requirements that are weighted at the weight of 1, except for 1, which is weighted at 5, which is the FIPS encryption. Companies must meet a weighting of 3 out of the 5 to be able to POAM that requirement. And the final 2, which would be the authorization and approval of the process from NIST, is what we recognize was a long pole in the tent. So that is a POAMable requirement from the last 2 weighted points perspective. One of the other things that we recognized that there was probably going to be a need for waivers. So the way a waiver would work is a program manager would do their market survey, and it may be that the industry that they're going to tap for their requirement is so innovative and new that they would not possibly be able to meet the CMMC requirements. So that program manager will be able to submit a waiver request up through their senior service acquisition executive to make sure that it is approved at the highest level. We do not anticipate very many waivers, where our anticipation is that that would be a rare exception to the program, but we did recognize that there could be a need for that going forward. Now, if you go to the next slide, we can talk about one of the other things that we talked about with CMMC and the controlled unclassified information and the way that we appropriate the levels. CMMC level 1 is just for federal contract information. That's the basic procurement information that you would handle, that you would want to keep secure, and that's going to be secured at the 52204-21 in line with the FAR, and those are just the 15 basic cyber hygiene requirements that you would have to meet. That's going to be a self-assessment that will be registered in the SPERS database, supplier performance rating system. You will do that self-assessment annually and affirm that you are in compliance on an annual basis for level 1. Level 2 is where people who handle CUI come in. And when we looked at controlled unclassified information, there was a thought that there would possibly be CUI that would not be as highly prioritized as some of the others, that would allow companies to be able to do a self-assessment against the NIST 800-171 requirements. You would do that triennially, but you would have an annual affirmation that you would have to submit in the SPERS database on an annual basis that you were still in compliance with those requirements. The next level, the prioritized CUI, you would need to go get a third-party assessment organization to come in and do a review of your system. Those would be good for 3 years as well, but it would also require that annual affirmation and spurs that you're still compliant with the requirements. Now, one of the things that we've been a lot of discussion about this bifurcation of level 2 out in the media. And truthfully, our analysis has shown that there will be a small number of companies that might be able to just only ever do a self-assessment. Because of the fact that most companies participate on more than one contract, it's expected that it only takes one contract with a higher level requirement to drive that need for an assessment. So our expectation is the number of companies that will only ever have to do a self-assessment is going to be very small. From there, you would move to the level 3. The level 3 assessment is going to be performed by the DCMA DIBCAC assessment arm. So what a company would do is they go out and get a third-party assessment done for CMMC level 2. Once that was complete, they call if they needed a level 3, you call the get in touch with the DIBCAC, schedule for them to come out and do an assessment that would be the delta from level 2 to level 3. So where are we in getting all this put together? My team, Mr. McKeown's going to grimace because we have 4 people on our team that are working extremely hard, burning the midnight oil to make sure that we get all the documentation and the rule text put together to be able to submit to OMB. Currently, our timeline is that we will have that information turned over to OMB mid-July to mid-August timeframe, presuming that we get everything documented in through the internal review before we pump it over to OMB. OMB then takes it, they have a process that we're not at liberty to discuss, and that back and forth will go on until hopefully March of 2023, where it is our hope, it's not a given, that OMB will grant us an interim rule. If we get an interim rule from OMB in March of 2023, that will kick off the 60-day public comment period. And we would be through that by May of 2023, at which point the department could start requiring CMMC in contracts. Now, our plan, based on where the CMMC ecosystem is to do a phased rollout like we have had planned in 1.0. It might not work exactly the same way. That's all predicated on how we get through rulemaking, how exactly that's going to look. But day 1, not everybody's going to be required to have a certification if you handle CUI. It's going to be a phased in approach. We have promised to make sure that companies would not end up in a scenario where I can't get a certification, but I want to participate on a contract. We're going to make sure that we meter it out to the point where we don't have anybody that fails to be able to get certified and is unable to participate on a contract that they wish to participate on. And to that end, if OMB does not grant us an interim rule, then it would everything would shift later out by another year. So it would be March of 2024 before we could get a final rule. That would mean that you would see it in contracts in May of 2024. And to that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McKeown. It's his turn.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sanjeev, for hosting this today, and thanks for everybody for attending. And I do want to compliment Stacy and her team. You know, they joined us here probably about 6 months ago and have become part of the CIO team here and have been doing heroes work on all of the recommendations that we made to streamline CMMC 1.0 and go to CMMC 2.0. And they're keeping things on track with a very limited staff, so I want to applaud her activities. Next slide, please. Some of you may have seen this before, but as we were briefing the DepSecDef on the changes that we wanted to make to CMMC, she had a larger question about what are we doing for DIB cybersecurity overall? As you know, CMMC is very focused on data, specifically controlled unclassified information. And much of what we have been doing leading up to CMMC with the 7012 clause, 7019, 7020, with the DIB CAC, all of that was really focused on protecting DoD data. So the set of controls that we're using with NIST 800-171 are really confidentiality and integrity controls. And they're not really focused that much on availability or resiliency within a supplier vendor's network. So she wanted to see the big picture of what we're doing, and then hopefully that would expose some of the gaps. So we ended up having 4 areas where we had lots of things underway already. Up in the upper left-hand quadrant, we have the cyber threat information intelligence sharing with the DIB. Here in the DoD CIO office, we manage the overall DoD DIB cybersecurity program, and we launched through DC3 and the DICE program a voluntary industry DoD partnership to share information. Recently, since I've been here over the last 20 months, we gave permission for NSA to work on what they're calling a left of boom intelligence sharing. They have access to very pristine intelligence. They have a way to sort of redact that and provide it to some of the largest vendors out there. When they're seeing something that may be leading up to an attack, they're sharing that information in real time and thwarting the enemy before the attack can occur. Additionally, DCSA, in their capacity as managers of all of the classified information at various contractor facilities, they certify the SIPRNet drops and the connectivity there. They also share classified intelligence signatures when that is warranted. As a part of 7012, embedded in there was not only that you had to do a self-assessment of 800-171 and report it in SPURS, but there was this mandatory reporting requirement. If a significant cyber incident occurred in your organization, you needed to report that within 72 hours. The DCICE is the clearinghouse for receiving those reports. They redact that information and share it out to all of the voluntary participants that volunteer to be part of the cyber threat intelligence sharing venue. And DCSA is the clearinghouse for anything that is a classified incident. So that's there, and that's codified as well. And then down in the lower right-hand quadrant, we have the cybersecurity technical assistance and collaboration. The DCICE, NSA, and DCSA all have a variety of offerings there to collaborate with our industry partners on a voluntary basis. We have a variety of tools, for instance, protective DNS. We do some expanse scanning, which is an outside-in look at your network and can tell you where there's easily exploitable vulnerabilities just by looking into your network, and then you can go about patching them. All of these collaboration services and tools that we have right now are free of charge. We encourage anybody that wants to sign up for that and participate in those and enhance their cybersecurity as a result of it. The same thing with the cyber threat information and intelligence sharing, completely voluntary. We'd love to get you on a memorandum of agreement with us so that we could share good cyber intelligence over time. In the lower left-hand quadrant is the DIB cybersecurity requirements and assessment mechanisms. And as I said early on, there was a requirement for 800-171. All you had to do was run the checklist yourself and report that in SPURS. Later on, we added in the DIB-CAC high assessments, where DIB-CAC would come in externally and perform an assessment and see if that lined up with what was being reported in SPURS. I'll tell you that over time, I think they've done about 150 of these since they stood up, and the numbers haven't been great as to you know, the self-assessments versus what DIBCAC was assessing. I think people were being generous on their own self-assessments, and the DIBCAC took a harder approach, and so we're working on that. CMMC originally was in ANS and now has migrated over to us in CIO, and that's when Stacy and her team joined us. And again, we are very focused on the protection of the data here in this particular section of the slide. I will tell you that with the Ukrainian invasion and the possible threats from Russian actors, there was a Shields Up effort, whole of government effort to get the word out and try to protect the defense industrial base from attacks. There was a few gaps that were exposed during this effort. One of the gaps was, you know, we have about, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 people signed up to be voluntary participants in our offerings here. But we think the DIB is way larger than that. We think maybe we're only capturing 1% of the DIB population. So we didn't have an opportunity to reach out to everyone and make positive contact on the messaging about the Russian cyber threats during this invasion of Ukraine. So we've got work to do there in establishing a repository of good contacts for all DIB partners so that we can get these messages out, and we're working that hard. Additionally, because we've been focused so hard on protecting the data, there is this resiliency aspect that we want to start working on and employing availability type of controls to DIB partners as well, so that if we suffered a cyber attack from Russia on a key component of something that we need for our own defense or that we're providing to the Ukraine, you know, it could possibly shut down the whole operation if, you know, somebody goes through a ransomware attack, for instance. It could be very much like the Colonial Pipeline situation where, you know, gas wasn't flowing on the whole East Coast for a period of time. So as we go forward and we're partnering with the DIB sector coordinating agencies and CISA, and trying to work on how we develop a cyber secure DIB framework. We think it's going to be based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. We're having a big discussion today in partnership. The GCC and the SEC are over at Boeing today, kind of working through some of the issues here so that we can start to get after not just protecting the data, but protecting your whole supply chain and making sure that it's up and operational and available when needed. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stacy and David, for the overview. So let's get into some of the things that are on the minds of the DIB. And our next 10 odd questions represent, you know, the broad themes that were echoed as we geared up for this webinar. So first, as we wait for CMMC to come into effect by, say, March of 2023, next year, can you clarify what are the contractors' existing DFARS obligations for protecting CUI today? As we understand it, you know, NIST 800-171 already applies, and contractors are required to enter their scores into SPRS. Could you clarify existing obligations under DFARS for contractors handling CUI?
If you currently have the DFAR 252-204-7012, which was the initial clause put into place to identify the NIST 800-171 as the requirements that a company must comply with to handle CUI, then you need to make sure that you have a system security plan. You've reviewed your compliance with those requirements, and if you don't meet all of them, that you have a plan of action and milestones in place to burn those off and get compliant, fully compliant with the NIST 800-171. That came into being December 31st of 2017. So it's not new, and they started working on it in 2013. So that's been around for a minute. So companies should be at least extremely familiar with those requirements. Last year, when we had our first interim rule under the 48 CFR, it was in conjunction with two other clauses, the 252-204-7019 and 7020. 7019 is a provision which states that companies who are interested in participating on these contracts that could handle controlled unclassified information need to go do that registration in SPRS as to where they think they stand today against the NIST 800-171 requirements. And then the 7020 clause went into effect to say that if you garner one of these contracts and the DCMA DivCAC knocks on your door to say, hey, I need to come in and validate that you are in compliance with those requirements, that you need to let them in. One of the things that, as Mr. McKeown said, when they started looking at all of the scores that were being entered into SPRS, people seemed to be very positive and think that they met the entire 110. And the DivCAC, having done 300 of these assessments and finding very few people actually had complied with 110, they've started doing a pilot program where they are going to start calling various, probably random contractors that have put their scores into SPRS to walk them through what we call a medium assessment, which is where they're going to sit down with you and talk with you about what you put in your documentation, what you saw, how you interpreted meeting and complying with that requirement, to gain an understanding of whether or not people have really started paying attention and understand what they're signing up for, or if there is a knowledge gap that we need to work on. So those are the things that you're required to do today.
Thank you.
If I could piggyback on that real quick. We were asked by Congress to apply 800-171 to ourselves and see how well we did. Obviously, we don't use 800-171. We use 853 controls in the risk management framework. So we did our best to do an apples to oranges comparison there and provide Congress results back. But I will say that once, when I was sort of researching the background behind all of this, this requirement to do 800-171 is not limited just to the DoD. I think we are just ahead of the rest of the federal government, but there actually is a CFR, I don't have it on hand right now, that says that, you know, non-federal networks that have CUI will use 800-171. And the DoD, of course, is out leading, and of course we've got CMMC, but I'm interested, you know, in collaborating with the rest of the federal government and seeing what they're going to do in this regard as far as their compliance with 800-171. Over.
So I think, David, as you mentioned, you know, there's a discrepancy between the NIST 800-171 scores reported by the contractors and what DivCAC actually found. We've been seeing increasing stepping up of enforcement to rectify this discrepancy. Could you comment a little bit more on the DOJ whistleblower initiatives and other initiatives that you are taking to enforce the NIST 800-171 compliance for those that are already saying that they are, you know, complying with it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to address that. So, yeah, the DOJ is potentially going to use the False Claims Act here whenever the DivCAC goes out and finds major disconnects between an assessment which they have done and what is being reported in SPRS. That's not a good scenario, but I think the worst scenario would be is this gets uncovered that someone has been severely compromised and the data that was in their SPRS database that reflected positively that they were doing cybersecurity well ends up being that wasn't the case in reality, and you know there's a major incident. That is even a worse scenario because you know not only is there the fraud, but major impact to a program potentially there. So that's really the reason why we want to get after this, because we want to protect that data and protect all of our DoD critical programs that are vital to national security. And so, yeah, DOJ is willing to help us out there with that False Claims Act.
Thank you. Stacy, you already introduced the clarification on limited time waivers. There's a perception that the limited time waivers is offering flexibility to embark on CMMC 2.0 only after a contractor has been awarded a contract. Can you offer some clarifications on this? Would that be a wise strategy?
No, it would not be a wise strategy. So the way it's going to work is you can garner a contract award if you have a POAM, but if you don't close that POAM out within the allotted amount of time after contract award, the contracting officer can hold you accountable through withholding payments, through show cause notices. They can start any kind of a termination if a company finds themselves unable to close out those POAMs, because it's very important for us to make sure that our data is protected. And one of the reasons why we're doing this is to protect the data. And if you have a POAM, that means that there's a vulnerability there because there is a requirement not met. So I do not suggest people wait on their laurels and not really take this seriously. We need to get on top of this right now. Another reason for complying and to look at this and implement these things in your companies is it protects you as well. We were talking the other day about all of the cage code issues that we're seeing. Companies are having their cage codes stolen and they're having their account information redirected. So you get some nefarious actor that comes in, they switch the banking information associated with your cage code. And when the payment from the federal government goes to that cage code, it goes into their bank account. I met a guy down in South Carolina. He lost $40,000. He was a construction contractor. He lost $40,000. And unfortunately, the federal government only had one $40,000 to give. So they didn't have another one to make him whole. The DOJ is kind of like, $40,000 isn't a big enough dollar value for us. We don't have time to go after that and figure out who stole it. So the poor guy was just out his money. So, taking these requirements seriously, looking at them is not only going to protect me and my data from DOD, but it's going to protect you and your intellectual property, your important account information, all of that.
Thank you. I want to dig in a little bit more. Thank you for the clarification over here. But perhaps $1 million question over here is that as the CMMC program gets rolled out, there is a perception amongst many that it is prudent to wait till the program details are finalized before commencing implementation of their compliance program. What's your guidance on this? I mean, we certainly understand that NIST 800-171 applies, but again, I think it will be good for the DIB to hear directly from David and you. Is it prudent for a DIB company to wait till the dust is settled on the final program details before commencing implementation of their compliance program?
You want to go first? You want me
to? I'll just quickly go. I don't think it's prudent to wait. The 800-171 requirement's been around for a long time. I think we're trying to, through the CMMC AB, allow early assessments even before this goes into effect as contract clause, and we want to honor those early assessments. But I think it would be better for companies to be able to accurately, honestly report exactly the state of their cybersecurity versus probably a lot of the guessing and pencil whipping that's going on now, where we're compliance is being reported, but we're not really close to being compliant when we finally go out there. So full adoption should have begun long ago. And I don't think they should wait any longer to get rolling on this. Over.
No, exactly. And the NIST 800-171 is not at discussion as far as our rulemaking is concerned. We all know that that's the requirement that you're going to have to comply with. So that's not going to change. So you need to make sure you take that on for yourself. And as Mr. McKeown teed up, we're talking about early adoption. And what we're looking at from that perspective is a joint surveillance capability. So the DIBCAC is currently coming up on the re-up of a bunch of their 300 companies that they started with, right? That some of these companies are coming up on their 3-year reassessment timeframe. And what they've recognized is their resources are low enough that they can't spread themselves thin enough to get everybody taken care of. So where we are in the picture is if a company wants and thinks that they're ready to do their assessment and compliance, they can contract with one of the C3 PAOs that are currently listed on the CMMC AB marketplace as approved C3 PAOs. Once you have your agreement in place and negotiated with that C3 PAO, the C3 PAO will convey that to the AB, who will get on a schedule with the DIBCAC. And so the joint surveillance program works this way. The DIBCAC assessors will be on site. They'll have 1, maybe 2 assessors on site with your C3 PAO assessment as it goes on to do some oversight. They will then accept the C3 PAO assessment report, be able to ingest that into the DIBCAC as if it were done by them. They have some regulatory requirements of things they have to check and align with for it to become a DIBCAC high assessment. They'll ingest that data into the EMAS database, which will show that the company has a DIBCAC high assessment in your score until such time as CMMC becomes put in place a thing, right? Once CMMC becomes about a requirement under the interim rule or the final rule, it is our hope and intent that we will be able to allow that certification to be in good stead for an additional 3 years, provided the company does its annual affirmation. Now, this could possibly change based on rulemaking. If somebody complains and has heartburn with it during the rulemaking process, we may be precluded from being able to do that. But at the get-go, the company will at least have that DIBCAC high assessment reported in SPRS for them for the next 3 years.
So I think that's a lot of information. If I could summarize it, you're suggesting over here or saying that number one, companies ought to start, moving because that's their current DFARS obligation. Second, CMMC is likely to be a rule in March 2023. That's the second reason to get started. And third, that there's a mechanism now in place where with the C3 PAOs, a company can start the assessment, process. And I'd like to re-clarify over here for the audience that you are thinking of an incentive to provide an additional year of compliance should a company go through the C3 PAO and DIBCAC assessment. Am I correct in my summary and in the incentive?
Pretty much, except for it would be, well, it depends on when the rule goes into place. You're right. It would either give you an extra, it'll be 3 years from the time CMMC goes into effect. So if it goes into effect next May, your certification would be good for 4 years. If it goes into effect after the final rule, your certification would be good for 5 years.
Great. So our next question deals with federally funded higher education institutions that conduct research. It is often asked, will CMMC apply to the whole university or only to those departments or functions that handle CUI?
So when we reorganized CMMC and made CMMC 2.0, one of our streamlining efforts was following the data, not being overly draconian that every company has to have a third-party assessment, especially when they don't even have any CUI that we're concerned with. So the same thing applies here. Only those parts of that institution where that data is being handled would have to be assessed and get coverage, not the whole university.
Thank you. That's abundantly clear. Our next question is on how CMMC applies to managed service providers. Are MSPs going to need to certify if they support DoD contractors?
So currently we're working, and we have to get in front of Mr. McKeown to get his approval on a plan for what would be required for managed service providers going forward for CMMC. There's a approach that we're going to put forth to see if we get agreement on, which would be a hybrid between FedRAMP and CMMC, and it will clearly outline what the requirements are that everybody, each partner would have in the agreement would have to meet as part of the requirement. And one of the things that we've heard so far, even looking at these things, is that contractor matrix, the customer responsibility matrix that goes part and part, those are very important. Companies that have struggled with it so far have had a difficulty getting those documents completed, and that's what needs to be done.
So it raises the point that, you know, documentation and is integral to compliance. So thank you for clarifying that, and that it requires significant work to accomplish that. Moving on, you mentioned, you know, CMMC 2.0 assessments through C3PAOs and ultimately making their way to DIBCAC. Could you offer your current thinking on when such assessments could begin? And secondly, what's your thinking on how eventually, you know, CMMC 2.0 assessments will scale? So it's a two-part question.
So the 2.0 assessments, the CMMC level 2 assessments can be begun now. I did notice a question. I tried to answer it and I ended up marking it as answered, and I didn't in the Q&A about when the cap is going to be released. We have been going back and forth between DoD and the AB with the cap. The cap right now is back with the AB to make final edits and make sure that it's buttoned up. I believe we might see it one more time and then it'll be released. So I'm hoping it's sooner rather than later. I don't want to give a false impression that it's going to be like tomorrow, but I'm thinking in the next couple of weeks, we should be able to have that released. And once all that documentation is out there, then we can start those C3PAO assessments today with the Joint Surveillance Program. For for the move from CMMC level 2 to CMMC level 3, we are codifying and solidifying those requirements out of the 172 that we're going to require. We need to make sure that we have the training program put in place, because the DIBCAC assessors will have to go through a training and exam process, just like the C3PAO assessors will for doing the level 3 assessment. So I would imagine that those will probably start. They're not going to be in the included in the first phase of the rollout when we roll the rule out. It'll be probably 6 months to a year after at the earliest.
Thank you. David had mentioned, you know, DFARS 7012, and that's in existence right now and applies to significant majority of the contractors that handle CUI. Could you comment on how DFARS 7012, particularly C through G, incident reporting requirements, will be a part of a CMMC assessment? So CMMC, to be clear, is 110 controls, but also you got DFARS requirements 7012 C through G, and we wanted some clarification from you that, you know, both would apply as to a contractor that handles CUI. So your thoughts on that?
So today, there is no expectation that we are going to sunset the 7012 clause. So you will see in your future requirements, the 7012 clause that sets the boundary of the 800-171 and the incident reporting requirements. And then the CMMC clause will also be included in your contract that will require the validation of that compliance. I think if I'm understanding your question, you're also asking, will the assessors be looking at whether or not you have appropriately reported an incident? That is not intended to be as part of their requirements today. That's something that's handled by DC3 and will be handled elsewise. Now, what we have always said, though, is if a company is certified and they suffer an incident, that there will be a forensic look that will be done to determine whether or not the assessor who gave them their certification missed something or made a misstep, and that we need to change the training or make sure that that the integrity of the process is still good. Or if the company had been compliant and then became negligent, right? That could be also a possibility. Or if this incident was as a result of something that our model or our requirements don't cover, and that would be an additional thing to look at to ensure that we have a model that is current and is on top of the threats that we're seeing as they come.
Thank you. So if I could summarize what I understood you saying is that CMMC assessments will be for the level 2 on the 110 controls, but DFARS 7012 C through G will continue to apply. And so while it may not be part of the CMMC assessment, the 7012 C through G compliance should also be addressed by a DIB contractor. Am I stating that correctly?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's very helpful.
Continue to report your incidences. Yes, don't stop doing that, please.
Our next question deals with reciprocity. Some defense contractors believe they have met many of the NIST 800-171 requirements because they comply with other standards such as ISO or FedRAMP. Can you offer guidance on your thinking on reciprocity with ISO or FedRAMP, or even the State Department's 120.54 on end-to-end encryption?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a fan of reciprocity, and I don't want to do rework when we're looking at exactly the same controls. I think it's a little cleaner as right now, like when DIBCAC goes out, if one of the vendors shows that they're utilizing FedRAMP certified services, it's very easy to run a check there and give credit for those controls, which are being satisfied by that offering. We'd have to probably do some more work in order to look at ISO and any other standards out there, but certainly those mappings exist, and I think we could easily do that. Right now, with the CMMC AB, I don't know if we've broached this particular topic. We certainly have with DIBCAC, and we're giving credit, but we probably need to have that conversation with the AB as well, just to make sure that they know that we do endorse reciprocity. And beyond reciprocity, we're also hoping that we will be able to perform some sort of FedRAMP-like assessment of a managed service or cloud service that meets many or even all of the 110 controls, and be able to put those on a consumable product list that companies can just go to and know that if they consume that, that they're going to get full credit for having satisfied CMMC. Over.
That will be very helpful. I think the industry will appreciate if there is such guidance on products and services that, as you mentioned, satisfy the controls and have been, and that is to the DoD and DIBCAC satisfaction. So we have a question that applies to relatively few of our participants today, but is important nonetheless to them. which is several of our registrants are from outside the United States. They're nonetheless defense contractors. What is the DoD's plan for applying CMMC to non-US entities?
The CMMC clause will be incorporated in contracts and will be a flow down requirement to subcontractors, which means it will touch international partners. Currently today, we are working through international agreements. Undoubtedly, my team is focused, laser focused right now on ensuring that we get through the rulemaking process and get that rule text put together. But we are also working hard with our Five Eyes partners and our allies to ensure that we do have a plan and path forward to meet those requirements.
Well, thank you. I think we are entering the last 6 minutes or so of our webinar, and you have provided us a wealth of information and clarifications on the program. And sometimes the wealth of information requires a summary. So I'd like to request from both of you a summary and a message to a defense contractor who's looking at all the changes that are happening, who's looking at the program becoming in effect in hopefully March of 2023. What's your message to the DIB, and especially a small to medium contractor, on what should they be doing now?
Okay, for starters, as we already touched on, making sure you're compliant with 800-171, however you do that, whether you trust your own staff to run the checklist and make sure that the compliance there and you have artifacts that demonstrate that the compliance is there, or whether you hire in a third-party assessor to do that. You definitely need to get on track with that if you're not already. I think that going forward, please be aware that the fact that we did CMMC 1.0 to 2.0 was due to hearing the issues which you have surfaced. So we tried to streamline it, make it more cost effective, make sure that we're protecting the right data, but we still are looking for feedback on where things could be made better. This hasn't gone into any contracts yet, but it soon will be, and we want to make it as good and as pain-free as possible while still achieving the.
Uh-oh. Is that him we lost, or is that?
I think we lost David's comments. So.
Ah, there he is. I think I heard him. Are you back?
David, could you repeat your last few sentences, because we lost you? I think he may be having
Technical
audio issues. Stacy, why don't you please fill in?
Okay, so this is when I wish I had I'm proud to be an American moment playing in the background, right? So one of the things that, companies need to understand that we as a nation are embarking on, it's not a new scenario, but we're definitely aware of the threats that are coming at us from different directions, and they're coming, right? We have people that are attacking us on a daily, hourly, moment by moment basis. Companies need to be secure, you need to be aware, and you need to be trying to get ahead of it and anticipating what the threats are, right? We've got ransomware attacks that have been in the news that everybody's totally aware of. Keep an eye on the CISA webpage for the emergent threats, our DoD CIO webpage for those threats. Be aware of what's coming at you and protect yourself. This is not something that we did just to be onerous and cause our contractors to have to do something that's not fun and cost them money. That wasn't our idea. We didn't wake up one day and say, how are we going to make this difficult to really make people hate working with us, right? We recognize that there's a threat. We're leaking information, and it's putting our warfighter at risk. And as a mother of a kid that would possibly have to go serve if called upon, I want to make sure what I put in the hands of that warfighter gives them the best opportunity to win. And to do that, we need to keep this data secure.
So I think that begs the question that, you are viewing the CMMC program not just as a check the box compliance. It certainly has the attributes of compliance, but the primary objective of the program is protection of critical, controlled, and classified information. It's cybersecurity for the
Yes, sir.
CMMC.
Yes, sir. Somebody asked me the other day, what's your dream for CMMC? And I got to the point where I said, my dream is that we don't have to require it anymore, that people do it because they understand how important it is to have those protections and protect themselves. I mean, it's your intellectual property as well as my data that you're protecting here, right? If you leave that front door open, your belongings are going to walk out the front door if nobody's watching them. And that's what we're here to. We're here to protect. We're not here to be a pain. We're here to help and give people guidance on how to protect their systems to make sure that they don't lose that information. Mr. McKeown, are you back? We lost you.
Yes, I am back. I don't know where I was at in my diatribe, but we dropped twice.
That happens.
Would you care to summarize?
Yeah, all I was saying is, definitely get out there, start tackling the 800, 171. It's very important and it's required. And if you don't feel like your staff is capable, you can outreach to us, or you could hire a third-party assessor to come in and assess you and get you on a path to, full compliance. And additionally, we want to hear from our industry partners as to what your pain points might continue to be. And as the rule is implemented, I want to hear what your pain points are so that we can start working on even additional modifications to make this work more seamlessly as we go forward. Over.
Well, thank you very much, Stacy and David. We are now in the home stretch, less than 8 or 9 months, hopefully, to the program being an interim rule. We appreciate your presence and taking the time for this webinar. I want to thank the Texas, Virginia, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island MEPs for being our partners in this webinar. And thank you for the attendees for taking the time to join us. Thanks a lot.